Okay, so origins of life on Earth, coming from nothing into something, is a crazy, crazy, crazy concept. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Lots of pictures this time, but definitely have something nearby so that you can be taking down additional notes, because there's going to be a lot of extra information today because we're talking about how life started, and that's crazy complicated. Origins of life, crazy things happening. We're starting on the early Earth here, and we are talking about how we got life out of truly nothing. So if you take a look at this picture right now, this is obviously not a real photograph because none of us were alive at the origin of the Earth. Okay, but this is some like 4.5 billion years ago when our Earth started to form. As you can see, it doesn't look like a real hospitable place. Okay, we have lots of toxic gases, volcanoes, lightning. Like the surface of the Earth hasn't even hardened yet. The plates are probably moving against one another as they do very rapidly, creating earthquakes. Very little water because it's really, really hot. There's no atmosphere or ozone that is protecting us from the UV rays of the sun. UV radiation can just come in and permeate the surface very easily. And somehow, which is our topic for today, we're going to get life out of this with a few key steps and just a few billion years, if you can even fathom what that would look like, we can actually have life out of this. But it requires a lot of spontaneity. So you have to feel kind of comfortable with the fact that these processes that we're talking about are taking millions of years for the most part. Okay, so it's not like it happened overnight. And you also have to realize that like molecules and things move, right? And so spontaneously, sometimes two things will form a collision. That's just going to happen, right? And there are certain things that are going to increase the frequencies of those collisions, which is going to help us to create some actual living things or parts of living things, organic material. Okay, so all right, refresher. We have four main things here that are just basically larger and larger versions of one another. Okay, so we have those atoms. So atoms certainly, obviously, were on the planet before life. So we had a lot of gases. We had a lot of methane. We had a lot of, so methane, CH4, ammonia, and NH3. No oxygen, and we'll talk about that, no oxygen. That's oftentimes like a trick question on the AP exam. They'll be like, which one of these things was not present on early Earth? And everyone just assumes oxygen was present because this is Earth. But we didn't have any of that hanging around. We had lots of other mainly toxic gases. From those gases, we're going to need to form these bottom things, which would be considered like compounds or molecules that are coming together with lots of different atoms. And eventually we're going to have to make those macromolecules that we talked about last week, right? Because these are the building blocks of life, okay? So if we're talking about building life, we're going to be talking about building the building blocks before building life itself. So those are going to be proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Because all of those things need to exist if we're going to make a cell. Cells are full of proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. And so if we're going to make something that's actually technically alive, we're going to need to make those things. Okay? Another really important thing to remember is that not only do we need these macromolecules, but we need to know the definition of what a living thing is. So the creation of life on Earth is going to start with the creation of a cell. And in order for something to be considered alive, it needs to be able to replicate and it needs to be able to produce energy. So if it can replicate and has a metabolism or is capable of producing energy, then we would consider that thing living. So proteins are not alive, lipids are not alive, nucleic acids are not alive, but if we put them all together into a cell that can replicate and produce its own energy, now we're talking life. Okay, so that's the goal today. We're going to talk about how cells are made, and then I'll show you like bigger picture how some other stuff is made as well. All right, this is super, super, super important to understand. So these are the four main steps that took place in order to, and we're going to go into detail for all four, in order to create life on Earth. Okay, and it makes sense as we're going through. We're like building off of the step previously because we're making more complex things. But the first thing that needs to happen, because again, we have just a bunch of gases and nothing organic. Organic are the building blocks of life, carbon-containing building blocks of life. So if you take organic chemistry, you'll talk about carbon all day, every day. But the first step is going to be abiotic synthesis. So abiotic, without life, non-living synthesis. Synthesis would mean to put together. of small organic molecules, okay? And I'm going to go through each of these in detail with its own slide, so stay tuned, okay? Second step, we're going to join these small organic molecules into macromolecules like proteins and nucleic acids and things like that, okay? So we're going to go from small organic molecules or building blocks into these macromolecules, okay? Next, these macromolecules are going to be packaged into something we call a protocell. Okay, so now we're getting towards what a cell might actually be. And then lastly, after all these macromolecules already exist inside this enclosed space called a protocell, we're going to have the origin of self-replicating molecules that lead to the capability of inheritance, which is a fancy way of saying that we're going to get some RNA that can self-replicate itself. Okay, so first things first. Abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules. What are those small organic molecules? Mainly proteins, nucleic acids, or nucleotides, which you can see over on the right-hand side of your screen, right? And these are going to be kind of some of those first precursors. So if you're seeing the components that are making these up, there's oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, for the most part, are going to be the main things that are making these guys up. So when I show you this next experiment, it's important to keep in mind exactly what we're looking for here. We need that nitrogen source, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen. So while I said that there wasn't any free gas oxygen like O2 on Earth, there was oxygen wrapped up in other compounds. All right, so couple theories with how we have this abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules, or how we could have possibly gotten nucleotides or amino acids onto the surface of the Earth, like the picture that I showed you in the beginning, where everything looks super, super toxic, okay? A couple different ideas. Obviously, none of us were there, right? So you have to kind of just realize that scientists have spent a really, really long time working to figure out how this is possible with lots of different experiments. And that's where we've gotten where we are, knowing what we know, that the production of these organic molecules is possible given what we know about early Earth's environment, okay? So a couple of theories here. One, scientists do believe, and they have shown via experiments with the gases that would have been present and the temperature of the atmosphere and all sorts of other things, that the atmosphere of early Earth is reducing, okay? So I'm going to teach you, and you might already know this if you've been in chemistry, but I'm going to teach you a little acronym here. Super, super important. So if you were with me last week when we talked about electrons and molecules, we talked about how a bond between two molecules is just the sharing of electrons. So if we want to make more bonds, like we're trying to build an organic molecule, we need lots of electrons, okay? So I'm going to give you this acronym here, RIG. So if you've taken a chemistry class, you've definitely heard this. But what RIG stands for is that oxidation, or an oxidizing atmosphere, is the loss of electrons. Okay, so the electrons are spontaneously being lost, or bonds are breaking in an oxidizing environment. On the flip side, RIG, reduction, is, or a reducing atmosphere, is gain of electrons. So things are spontaneously gaining electrons if the environment is reducing. Okay, so scientists have basically proven and theorized that the environment, especially near volcanoes, which there were a bajillion of because the plates weren't solid yet, and so lava was pouring up through the surface, were incredibly reducing. And remember, reduction is gain of electrons. So molecules were naturally gaining electrons, which means they're naturally capable of forming more bonds, which makes it a little bit easier to get some small organic molecules out of just individual atoms or smaller molecules. Okay, so that's one idea that scientists have proven to be true. Second theory, meteorites. Some scientists believe that perhaps meteorites or space rocks came from a different planet and brought with it kind of some building blocks or some amino acids or some nucleotides or something like that. More likely than that, though, is that we're going to use the energy. So sources of energy like lightning and volcanoes, we're going to use that heat and that energy and use that to kind of combine ammonia and methane into these more complex things. And remember that this is not happening overnight. It takes, and I'll show you a graphic in a little bit, it takes a really, really long time to synthesize small organic molecules into something that's going to be usable, because we don't see life for like 1.4 billion years or something ridiculous, something that long. And so it's important to realize that this is taking a very long time to occur. Okay, so you absolutely must be familiar with the Miller-Urey experiment. I'm sure your teacher will talk to you about it if they haven't already. I'm sure they will test you on it, and it usually shows up on AP exams. But Miller and Urey are two scientists working at the University of Chicago, and they basically recreate early Earth's environment in this crazy contraption that you see here. Okay, so they have water, ammonia, methane, hydrogen gases that would have been present on early Earth's surface. And then they have a spark from like electrodes going through it that would represent perhaps lightning or the energy provided by a volcano, okay? Because there has to be some sort of energy source if we're going to see this kind of spontaneous combination. And then what they do is they let this spark with the gases, right, for an extended period of time. And then they cool this down and they run it through some warm water, which you can see this heating source at the bottom. And they continue this process of then allowing this to evaporate again, which will bring these gases back up and cooling it. And over time, with the spark, with the spontaneity of bonds and the reducing environment that they create, they were actually able to take this water out and sample it, and they were able to find amino acids in that water. Okay, so basically what they did is they proved to a lot of very skeptical people that this theory of like spontaneity with these gases present and this energy source and this water source actually could lead to something as magnificent as an amino acid over time. Okay, so this is all still just step one. How are we getting those building blocks, amino acids and proteins? Okay, so I provided a lot of different theories there for you. Miller-Urey is the most important one to know about, but you need to know that these amino acids and these nucleotides and these other building blocks could have certainly spontaneously arisen from the early Earth conditions.